Why are you all talking about dividing my house while I'm still sitting in the room? The question left my mouth before I even realized I had spoken. 3 heads turned toward me at the same time. My son Michael froze with a folder in his hand. My daughter Rebecca immediately looked away. And my youngest son Daniel suddenly became very interested in the glass of water sitting on the table. For a few seconds, nobody answered. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. I was 74 years old, standing in the doorway of the dining room of the house I had owned for 36 years, and I felt like a stranger listening to people discuss the belongings of a dead man. The silence told me everything. Then Michael cleared his throat. Dad, that's not what we were doing. It was a lie. A terrible lie. The kind of lie people tell when they know they've been caught. I looked at the stack of papers spread across the dining table. Property assessments, bank statements, insurance documents, my documents, my life reduced to numbers. And suddenly, I realized something that shook me more than the death of my wife 6 months earlier. My children were no longer worried about losing me. They were worried about what would happen to everything I owned when I was gone. The realization hit me like ice water. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. My name is Richard Thompson. I am 74 years old. For 42 years, I was married to the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Her name was Margaret. She died on a Tuesday afternoon in March at exactly 2:17 p.m. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock the moment the heart monitor stopped making noise. Some memories burn themselves into your mind forever. That was one of them. People often imagine grief as a dramatic thing. They imagine tears. Screaming. Breaking down. For me, grief arrived quietly. It arrived in the form of a second coffee cup that never needed washing. A half-empty closet. A side of the bed that remained perfectly untouched every morning. The silence was what hurt most. Margaret had a way of filling every room she entered. When she disappeared, the entire house felt hollow. For the first few weeks after the funeral, my children were wonderful. They called constantly, visited often, brought food, checked on me. Michael came every Saturday. Rebecca called every evening. Daniel visited twice a week despite living almost 90 miles away. They all made the same promise. We'll always take care of you, Dad. At the time, I believed them. Why wouldn't I? They were my children. I had spent my entire life believing family meant something. Believing blood meant loyalty. Believing love survived hardship. But life has a way of revealing people's true priorities when money enters the room. And unfortunately, money had entered ours. You see, Margaret and I were not wealthy by billionaire standards. But we had done well. Very well. When I was 26 years old, I started a small industrial supply company with a loan of $18,000. I worked 18-hour days for nearly a decade. There were years when I slept on warehouse floors. Years when I missed birthdays. Years when I questioned every decision I'd ever made. But eventually the business succeeded. By the time I sold it at age 63, the company employed 127 people and generated annual revenue of just over $14 million. The sale changed everything. Margaret and I paid off every debt, invested carefully, lived comfortably, not extravagantly, comfortably. When Margaret died, our combined assets totaled approximately $4.8 million. The house alone was worth around $1.3 million. Enough money to make people think differently. Enough money to expose character. Enough money to destroy families. And mine was no exception. The first warning sign appeared only 8 weeks after the funeral. At the time, it seemed insignificant. A casual comment. A harmless question. The kind of thing most people would forget. But looking back, that was where the change began. Michael was sitting in my kitchen. He was 50 years old. Successful. Organized. Practical. The type of man who always carried a planner. Always arrived early. Always had a 5-year strategy. While drinking coffee, he casually asked, "Dad, have you updated the estate documents since Mom passed?" I remember laughing. "Your mother has been gone less than 2 months. He nodded. "I know, I'm just thinking ahead." Thinking ahead. The phrase sounded reasonable. Responsible even. So I answered his questions. I had no idea they were the first steps toward something much larger. Much uglier. And much more painful. To be continued. For the next several weeks, I convinced myself Michael's questions meant nothing. After all, he had always been the planner in the family. Even as a child, he organized his baseball cards by year and manufacturer. When he was 12, he created a spreadsheet to track his allowance. When he was 16, he calculated exactly how much gasoline he would need each month after getting his driver's license. Planning was simply who he was. At least that was what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. And deep down, I think I already knew it. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives without warning. Most of the time, small signals appear long before the final blow. We simply choose not to see them. A few weeks later, Rebecca visited. She was 47 years old and worked as a high school counselor. Unlike Michael, she lived through emotions. She always had. As a child, she cried during cartoons. As an adult, she could spend an entire evening worrying about a stranger she had met once in a grocery store. People trusted her because she genuinely cared. Or at least they thought she did. That afternoon, she sat across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where Margaret and I had eaten nearly 15,000 meals together. Rebecca stirred her tea and looked around the room. It's strange imagining someone else living here someday. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "After you're gone." There it was again. Not concern about my life. Concern about what happened after my life. I laughed awkwardly. "I'm not planning on going anywhere anytime soon." She smiled. "Of course not, Dad." But her eyes moved toward the house around her. Toward the hardwood floors. Toward the staircase. Toward the property. Toward the value. Toward the future. And once again, I ignored the feeling in my stomach. The feeling that something wasn't right. The feeling Margaret would have recognized immediately. She was always better at reading people than I was. Always. When we first met, I was 22. She was 20. 3 weeks after our first date, she correctly predicted which of my friends would end up divorced. 20 years later, she correctly predicted which business partner would eventually try to cheat me. She saw patterns. She noticed motives. She understood people. I understood numbers. Together we balanced each other. Without her, I became vulnerable in ways I didn't fully appreciate. The third warning sign arrived in June. 3 months after Margaret's death. Daniel invited me to dinner. Daniel was 44. The youngest. The dreamer. The creative one. The child who never quite found stability. Over the years, he had started 6 businesses. 3 failed within months. 2 lasted less than 2 years. 1 survived but generated barely enough income to support his family. Daniel wasn't irresponsible. That would be too simple. He simply believed every new opportunity would finally be the one. The breakthrough. The success story. The answer. That night he talked excitedly about a new investment idea. A commercial property project. A partnership. A development opportunity. I listened patiently. Then came the question. Dad, have you ever considered helping me invest? There it was. Money. Again. I declined politely. He smiled, acted understanding, changed the subject, but disappointment flashed across his face for a fraction of a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did, and suddenly all three conversations began connecting in my mind. Estate documents, the future of the house, investment money, different words, same destination. My children were thinking about my assets, far more than they were thinking about me. I wish I could say I confronted them. I didn't, partly because I was grieving, partly because I was lonely, mostly because parents spend their entire lives creating excuses for their children. It starts when they're toddlers. They're tired. They're stressed. They didn't mean it. They'll grow out of it. And somehow those excuses continue even when the children are 50 years old. So I kept making excuses. Until August. August changed everything. It happened during a family barbecue. 23 people attended. Children, grandchildren, spouses, neighbors, friends. For most of the afternoon, everything seemed normal. People laughed. The grandchildren played in the yard. Burgers cooked on the grill. The kind of summer day Margaret loved. I remember standing near the patio watching my grandchildren run through sprinklers. For a moment I felt almost peaceful. Then I heard voices coming from the side garden. Michael, Rebecca, Daniel. At first I wasn't paying attention. Then I heard my names. I stopped walking. Not intentionally. My feet simply froze. Michael was speaking. The house is obviously the biggest issue. Rebecca replied immediately. Why should you decide that? Daniel laughed. Because he already has a house worth almost $800,000. A cold sensation spread through my chest. I wasn't supposed to hear this conversation. They thought they were alone. They thought I was inside. They thought I was unaware. And because of that, they were honest. Painfully honest. Michael crossed his arms. I'm being realistic. Rebecca shook her head. You're being selfish. Daniel stepped closer. We're all being selfish. Nobody denied it. Nobody argued. Nobody said they were discussing things out of concern for me. Because they weren't. They were discussing distribution, allocation, inheritance, ownership, as if I were already dead. As if I were a legal event waiting to happen. As if my life had become an administrative problem. I stood there listening, unable to move, unable to speak. Rebecca finally sighed. We shouldn't even be talking about this. For one brief moment hope returned. Then she added, at least not until we know exactly what's in the accounts. The hope disappeared. Completely. I quietly walked away before they saw me. I returned to the house, sat in my office, closed the door, and stared at the framed photograph sitting on my desk. Margaret, smiling, happy, alive. The photo had been taken during our 40th anniversary trip to Maine. I remember staring at her face for nearly an hour. Finally, I said something out loud. Something I hadn't said since her funeral. I miss you. The room remained silent. But somehow I knew what she would have said. She would have told me to stop making excuses. She would have told me to look at reality. She would have told me the truth. The truth was simple. My children loved me. But they loved something else too. The future they imagined receiving after I was gone. And those two feelings were beginning to compete with each other. The realization hurt more than I can adequately describe. Because there is a unique pain that comes from understanding your children see your death as part of their financial planning. Not because they want you gone, but because they have already started organizing the benefits. That night I made a decision. Not the final decision. Not yet. But the first step. The step that would eventually change everything. The next morning I called my attorney. His name was Harold Simmons. We had worked together for almost 30 years. He answered on the second ring. "Richard, how are you holding up?" I looked around the empty house. The quiet rooms. The photographs. The memories. Then I answered honestly. "Not as well as I thought." There was a pause. Then Harold said something that would alter the course of my life. "Come see me tomorrow, there's something we need to discuss." At the time, I had no idea that meeting would eventually lead to a decision my children would never see coming. A decision that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about me. And by the time they discovered the truth, it would already be too late. To be continued. The next morning I arrived at Harold Simmons' office at 9:05 a.m. He was 71 years old, 3 years younger than me, and one of the few people left who had known me before success arrived. Before the company. Before the money. Before the large house. Before life became complicated. His office hadn't changed in decades. The same dark wooden shelves. The same framed certificates. The same coffee that somehow tasted terrible every single year. Harold closed the door and studied me for several seconds. "You look exhausted." "I haven't been sleeping." He nodded. "I figured." Then he asked a question nobody else had asked since Margaret died. "Not my children. Not my friends. Not my neighbors. Nobody. Are you lonely?" The word hit harder than expected. Lonely. Not grieving. Not depressed. Lonely. I looked away. Because the answer was yes. Painfully yes. The house that once felt full now felt enormous. Every room echoed. Every hallway reminded me of someone missing. Every evening felt longer than the one before. Harold listened quietly while I talked. For nearly an hour. I told him everything. The conversations. The inheritance discussions. The comments about the house. The feeling that my children had started looking beyond me. Toward what remained after me. When I finished, Harold remained silent for a moment. Then he leaned back. "I have a question." "What?" "If you died tomorrow, would your children fight?" The answer came immediately. Yes. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just truth. Harold nodded slowly. I suspected that. The fact that he suspected it hurt. Because it meant the signs weren't subtle. It meant other people could see what I had been trying not to see. Then he opened a file. "Richard, I've spent 45 years handling estates." I listened carefully. "I've learned something." "What?" "The money rarely causes the conflict." I frowned. "What does?" "The money reveals the conflict that already exists." That sentence stayed with me. Because it felt true. Michael wasn't greedy. Rebecca wasn't cruel. Daniel wasn't selfish in the cartoon villain sense people imagine. The problem was deeper. Each of them believed their needs were reasonable. Each of them believed their circumstances justified their position. Each of them had quietly built a story in which they deserved a larger piece than the others. And when multiple people believe that at the same time, conflict becomes inevitable. Harold slid a document toward me. "What is this?" "A list." "A list of what?" "Organizations currently looking for major charitable donors." I stared at him. Then laughed. "You move quickly." "I'm not suggesting anything." "Sure you aren't." A small smile appeared on his face. No, I'm suggesting you think carefully about what kind of legacy you actually want. Legacy. The word followed me home. Most people think legacy means money. Assets. Buildings. Investments. But sitting alone in my kitchen that evening, I realized something uncomfortable. Money wasn't my legacy. It never had been. My real legacy was supposed to be my family. And somehow that was the very thing causing me pain. A week later, something unexpected happened. Something that changed my perspective. Every Thursday morning, I volunteered at the local community centre. Margaret and I had started volunteering there 7 years earlier. After her death, I continued. Partly to honour her. Partly because it got me out of the house. That Thursday, I met a woman named Alina. She was 82 years old. Widowed, sharp-minded, blunt, the type of person who says exactly what she's thinking. After talking for 20 minutes, she asked, "How many children do you have?" 3. She smiled. "Do they visit?" "Sometimes." Her smile disappeared. "That's not what I asked." I laughed. "No, not as often as they used to." She nodded as though confirming a theory. Then she told me her story. Her husband had died 14 years earlier. She had 2 sons. Both successful. Both financially comfortable. Both extremely busy. For years they promised to visit. Promised to call. Promised to spend time with her. Then life kept getting in the way. Weeks became months. Months became years. One son lived 30 minutes away. The other lived less than an hour away. She saw them 4 times the previous year. I asked if she was angry. She surprised me. No. Why not? Because anger requires expectation. The sentence stunned me. She continued. I stopped expecting them to be different. There was no bitterness in her voice. No hatred. Just acceptance. A quiet understanding of reality. That afternoon I drove home thinking about expectations. Specifically my own. Had I expected too much? Had I created a fantasy version of family? Had I confused love with loyalty? Had I mistaken promises for guarantees? The questions followed me for days. Then September arrived. And with it came the moment that changed everything. Michael invited everyone to dinner. My children. Their spouses. Me. At first nothing seemed unusual. The meal was pleasant. The conversation normal. Then dessert arrived. And Michael made a mistake. A very revealing mistake. He thought he was being practical. Instead, he exposed exactly what was happening. He looked around the table. Then directly at me. "Dad, have you thought about downsizing?" The room became quiet. Rebecca immediately looked uncomfortable. Daniel stared at his plate. I set down my fork. "Why?" Michael spoke carefully. "This house is large." "Yes." "You live alone." "Yes." "It might be easier to manage something smaller." There it was. Wrapped in concern. Disguised as practicality. Presented as helpful advice. But everyone at the table understood the real conversation. Including Michael. Especially Michael. I asked a simple question. What would happen to this house? He hesitated. Only for a second. But it was enough. Enough to reveal everything. Enough to expose motive. Enough to confirm what I already suspected. Finally he answered. "We'd figure that out." "We." Not me. Not you. "We." The word echoed through my mind. Because somehow my house had already become a collective discussion. A future asset. A shared expectation. Something waiting to be distributed. For the rest of the evening, I barely spoke. I listened, observed, watched, and for the first time in my life, I looked at my children not as a father, but as a witness watching people reveal themselves. Not through dramatic actions, through small assumptions, small expectations, small glimpses into how they viewed the future. When I returned home that night, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't read. I didn't make coffee. Instead, I walked into Margaret's old sewing room. December arrived colder than usual. The first snowstorm hit on the 3rd day of the month. I remember standing at the living room window, watching the snow collect on the front lawn Margaret loved so much. For years she had planted flowers there. Tulips in spring, roses in summer, chrysanthemums in autumn. Every season had its own colour. Now the entire yard was covered in white. Quiet, still, beautiful, and somehow lonely. The strange thing was that while the weather became colder, my mind became clearer. For months I had been confused, hurt, uncertain. Now I knew exactly what I was doing. Harold and I had finalized nearly every detail. The documents existed. The structure existed. The future existed. Nobody knew except Harold, Susan, and me. Not even my children. Especially not my children. I wasn't hiding it out of spite. I was hiding it because expectations change behavior. And I wanted to see people clearly. Without influence. Without performance. Without anyone pretending. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days before Christmas, Michael called. "Dad, can we talk?" His voice sounded serious. Of course. In person. I already knew what was coming. Not because I was psychic. Because patterns become predictable once you stop ignoring them. We agreed to meet at my house. The next afternoon, he arrived carrying a leather folder. That immediately told me everything. People don't bring folders to emotional conversations. They bring folders to business conversations. After a few minutes of small talk, he opened it. Inside were documents, charts, notes, printed pages. I stared at them, then at him. "What is all this?" He took a deep breath. "Dad, I think we need a family estate plan." There it was. Finally. No disguise. No subtlety. No pretending. Just the truth. Or at least his version of it. I leaned back in my chair. "Go on." Michael visibly relaxed. As though he had been waiting months to have this conversation. I think everyone would benefit from clarity. Clarity. Another professional word. Another corporate phrase. I noticed how often these discussions sounded like board meetings. He continued, "If something happens unexpectedly, things could become complicated." "What things?" "The house. The investments. The accounts. The assets. Assets. Not memories. Not family. Not relationships. Assets." I listened quietly. For nearly 20 minutes. Then I asked a simple question. "Have you spoken to Rebecca and Daniel about this?" His hesitation lasted less than a second. But it was enough. "Yes." I nodded slowly. Of course he had. This wasn't a spontaneous idea. This was a coordinated concern. Perhaps even a coordinated strategy. Not malicious. Not evil. Just revealing. Very revealing. Finally I asked, "Michael, are you worried about me?" He blinked. The question caught him off guard. "Of course I am." "No." I shook my head. "Are you worried about me, or are you worried about what happens after me?" The room became silent. For the first time in the conversation, He didn't have an immediate answer. Because some questions are difficult precisely because they force honesty. Eventually he looked away. And that told me everything. The conversation ended politely. Respectfully. No argument. No shouting. No drama. Just two men sitting across from each other, understanding more than either wanted to admit. When he left, I sat alone for a long time. Not because I was upset. Because I was sad. There is a difference. Anger wants action. Sadness simply wants understanding. A week later, New Year's Eve arrived. Traditionally, our entire family gathered at my house. Margaret loved hosting it. After her death, everyone agreed we should continue the tradition. At least that was the official reason. Looking back, I suspect some people were equally interested in maintaining visibility. Keeping track. Staying informed. The evening started normally. Food. Laughter. Stories. Children playing games. Everything appeared fine. Until around 9:30 p.m. That's when Daniel made a mistake. A significant mistake. He had consumed more wine than usual. Not enough to be drunk. Enough to become careless. Carelessness often reveals what discipline hides. We were standing in the kitchen when he casually asked, "Dad, have you ever thought about putting the house into a trust?" The question immediately attracted attention. Michael looked over. Rebecca froze. Even their spouses became quiet. Interesting. Very interesting. Because people only react that way when a topic has already been discussed. Repeatedly. I smiled. Why? Daniel shrugged. No reason. A lie. A terrible lie. Everyone knew it. Including him. I decided to push slightly. No reason at all. He laughed nervously. I'm just curious. Curious. Another lie. The room had suddenly become uncomfortable. Nobody wanted the conversation. But nobody wanted to leave it either. Finally, Rebecca stepped in. Maybe we should talk about something else. Daniel nodded quickly. Good idea. Too late. The damage had already been done. Not because of what he said. Because of how everyone reacted. The silence. The expressions. The discomfort. The collective awareness. That night, after everyone left, I stood alone in the driveway. The snow crunched beneath my shoes. The house was quiet again. And for the first time, I realized something important. My children weren't waiting for me to die. That would have been simpler. They were waiting for certainty. Waiting for information. Waiting for control. Waiting for reassurance that their expectations would eventually become reality. And because they lacked certainty, anxiety was growing. Anxiety creates pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. Mistakes reveal truth. January proved that theory. 3 weeks into the new year, Rebecca invited me to lunch. At first it seemed like a normal visit. Then halfway through the meal she asked, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are your estate documents updated?" I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. Almost identical to Michael's question months earlier. I set down my coffee. Why does everyone suddenly care so much about my paperwork? Her face turned red. Immediately. A sign she wasn't prepared for directness. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Silence. Then she looked down. And something unexpected happened. For the first time, honesty appeared. Real honesty. Not complete honesty. But enough. We don't want problems later. There it was. The truth. Or part of it. I nodded. I understand. And I did. That was the difficult part. I genuinely understood. They had families, mortgages, responsibilities, concerns. They wanted certainty. The tragedy wasn't that they wanted certainty. The tragedy was that they wanted certainty more than connection. At least lately. A week later, Harold called. Everything is ready. I stared out the window. At the frozen yard. At the empty bird feeder Margaret used every winter. At the house everyone seemed so interested in inheriting. Everything. A strange calm settled over me. Months of planning. Months of observation. Months of difficult truths. All leading to this moment. I scheduled the appointment for the following Tuesday. The documents required signatures. Witnesses. Final confirmations. Once completed, nothing could be undone without my approval. And I had no intention of changing my mind. Because by then I knew something my children didn't. The decision was no longer about money. It was about values. About legacy. About what kind of story would remain after I was gone. And very soon, events would accelerate faster than anyone expected. Because an important visitor was about to enter my life. A visitor whose arrival would expose everything. A visitor who would unintentionally trigger the moment my children finally realized they had misunderstood me completely. And when that day arrived, the consequences would be impossible to ignore. To be continued. The visitor arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. At first I assumed she was lost. I was sitting in the living room reading when the doorbell rang. Outside stood a young woman I had never seen before. She looked nervous. Maybe 30 years old. Holding a folder against her chest. I opened the door. "Can I help you?" She smiled awkwardly. "I hope so." Her name was Emily Carter. And within 10 minutes, she would remind me of something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Purpose. I invited her inside. We sat in the kitchen. The same kitchen where Margaret and I had spent thousands of mornings drinking coffee together. Emily carefully placed the folder on the table. Then she explained why she had come. 3 years earlier, Margaret and I had anonymously funded a scholarship program through the community centre. Not a huge program. Just enough to help students who couldn't afford college expenses. We never told anyone. Not our children. Not our friends. Nobody. Margaret preferred it that way. Good deeds become smaller when they're performed for applause, she used to say. Emily was one of the students who had received assistance. The scholarship covered books, transportation, and part of her tuition. Without it, she likely would have dropped out. Instead, she graduated. With honours. Now she worked as a physical therapist. She had spent months trying to identify the donors. Eventually, Susan told her the truth. After learning Margaret had passed away, Emily wanted to thank me personally. That's why she was sitting in my kitchen. That's why she had come. For nearly an hour she talked. Not about money. Not about inheritance. Not about property. About opportunity. About gratitude. About how a relatively small act had changed the direction of her life. When she finished, she handed me a letter. Inside was a handwritten note. Several pages long. At the end she wrote, "Your generosity helped me become the person I wanted to be. I hope one day I can do the same for someone else." I read that sentence 3 times. Then folded the letter carefully. Something tightened in my throat. Because for months, every conversation in my life had centered around assets. And suddenly someone appeared whose entire future had been changed by a tiny fraction of those assets. Not because she expected anything. Because someone believed in her. After Emily left, I sat alone for a long time. Thinking. Reflecting. Remembering. That evening I drove to the cemetery. I hadn't visited in several weeks. Winter made it difficult. The cold, the snow, the silence. But something told me to go. Margaret's grave looked peaceful beneath a thin layer of snow. I stood there for nearly an hour, talking quietly, the way witches sometimes do when nobody is watching. Telling her about Emily, about the scholarship, about the children, about everything. Eventually I laughed. A sad laugh. Then I said, "You were right again." Because she was. She almost always was. The following week, Harold finalized the last documents. The signatures were completed. Witnesses confirmed everything. The plan officially existed. Legally. Permanently. For the first time in nearly a year, I felt peace. Real peace. Not denials. Not distraction. Peace. Unfortunately, my children interpreted that peace differently. They mistook it for distance. And distance made them nervous. Especially Michael. By March, exactly 1 year after Margaret's death, he had become noticeably impatient. The calls increased. The questions increased. The suggestions increased. One evening he called unexpectedly. "Dad, are you free tomorrow?" "Why, I think we should all sit down together." There was something unusual in his voice. Determination. Preparation. A sense that he had finally decided something. I already knew what was coming. Still, I agreed. The meeting happened Saturday afternoon. All 3 children arrived. Together. That alone was unusual. Normally schedules prevented coordinated visits. This time they somehow managed. Interesting. Very interesting. We sat in the dining room. The same room where I had first overheard them discussing my house months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. For several minutes nobody spoke. Finally Michael cleared his throat. "Dad, we need to talk." There it was. The famous sentence. The sentence people use before conversations nobody wants. I nodded. Okay. Rebecca looked uncomfortable. Daniel looked nervous. Michael looked prepared. Very prepared. He opened a folder. Another folder. I almost smiled. Apparently everyone in my family had started carrying folders. Then he spoke. "We've been worried." I waited. "About what?" "You." The answer sounded rehearsed. Carefully chosen. Polished. Not entirely false. But not entirely true either. I let him continue. "We live alone." "Yes. The house is large." "Yes. You're getting older." There it was. Not cruel. Technically accurate. And yet somehow revealing. Michael leaned forward. "We think you should consider moving." Silence filled the room. I looked at each of my children. One by one. Michael, Rebecca, Daniel. 3 people I loved more than words could describe. 3 people who had somehow convinced themselves this conversation was about my well-being. Perhaps part of it was. But only part. I asked quietly. "And what happens to the house?" Nobody answered immediately. That told me everything. Finally Daniel spoke. "It could be sold." Rebecca nodded. "Or rented." Michael added. "There are several options." Options. Interesting word. Again, nobody talked about what I wanted. Only what could happen. What should happen. What made sense. For nearly 20 minutes they explained their reasoning. Practicality. Safety. Maintenance. Efficiency. Some of their arguments were legitimate. Some genuinely concerned. Others less so. Eventually, Michael said something he immediately regretted. I saw the regret appear the moment the words left his mouth. We just think it's important to organize things before it's too late. Too late. The room went silent. Completely silent. Because everyone understood what he meant. Even him. Especially him. I leaned back slowly. Then asked a question. The question that changed everything. What exactly are you afraid of losing? Nobody answered. Not immediately. Because sometimes silence answers better than words. I waited. Finally, Rebecca whispered. Dad. But she didn't finish. Because she couldn't. Because the truth was sitting in the room between us. Visible. Heavy. Impossible to ignore. They weren't afraid of losing the house. They weren't afraid of losing the money. They weren't afraid of losing possessions. They were afraid of uncertainty. And uncertainty had slowly transformed into expectation. Expectation had transformed into entitlement. And entitlement had transformed into pressure. Not maliciously. Not intentionally. But undeniably. I stood up. Walked to the window. Looked outside. Then turned back toward them. And for the first time in more than a year, I decided complete honesty was necessary. What I said next would shock every person in the room. Because none of them had any idea what I had already done. And once they heard it, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. To be continued. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. For years that sound had blended into the background of daily life. Now it seemed louder than ever. I looked at my children. 3 adults. 3 people with careers, families, responsibilities, and lives of their own. For a moment, I didn't see the people sitting in front of me. I saw memories. Michael at age 8 riding a bicycle for the first time. Rebecca at 11 crying because she found an injured bird. Daniel at 6 refusing to sleep without his favorite blanket. The memories made what came next even harder. Because love doesn't disappear when disappointment arrives. If anything, it makes disappointment hurt more. I took a slow breath. Then I spoke. I need all of you to listen carefully. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. I know you've been discussing my house. The reaction was immediate. Rebecca's face lost color. Daniel stared at the floor. Michael remained still, but his expression tightened. I continued. I know you've discussed my investments. Silence. I know you've discussed my accounts. Maury silence. And I know you've discussed what happens after I die. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Unavoidable. Nobody denied it. That told me everything. Finally Rebecca whispered. Dad. I raised a hand gently. Please let me finish. She nodded. Tears had already appeared in her eyes. I wasn't surprised. Rebecca always felt emotions deeply. The problem wasn't that she felt them. The problem was that she often felt them too late. I walked back to the table. Then sat down. For a moment I simply looked at them, trying to decide how much truth they were ready to hear. Finally I said, For months I've listened. Michael swallowed. Hard. I noticed. At first I thought I was imagining things. Nobody spoke. Then I thought maybe I was being unfair. Still silence. Then I realized something. What? Daniel asked quietly. I looked directly at him. You stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a future event. The sentence landed like a stone. Nobody had a response. Because they knew there was truth in it. Not complete truth. But enough. I continued. When your mother died, you promised you would take care of me. Rebecca began crying softly. I know. No. I shook my head gently. You don't. The room became even quieter. If taking care of me means discussing where my property goes after I'm dead, then you're taking care of my things, not me. Michael looked away. The first sign his confidence was breaking. Then came the question they had unknowingly been building toward for nearly a year. Michael asked it. Dad, what are you saying? I folded my hands. Then answered calmly. I'm saying I've already made my decisions. Nobody moved. What decisions? Daniel asked. I looked at all three. Then said the words that changed everything. My estate plan is finished. For several seconds, nobody reacted. Then confusion appeared. Followed by concern. Followed by alarm. Michael spoke first. When? Months ago. Rebecca blinked. Months. I nodded. Yes. Daniel looked stunned. You never told us. No. Why not? The answer came easily. Because it wasn't your decision. Silence. Again. The kind of silence that reveals far more than conversation. Then Michael asked the question he couldn't stop himself from asking. What does the plan say? There it was. The real question. Not how I felt. Not why I was hurt. Not whether I was okay. What does the plan say? I noticed Rebecca close her eyes. She noticed it too. That realization hurt her. I could see it. The truth is often painful because it arrives unexpectedly. I leaned back. I'm not discussing details. Michael looked shocked. Why not? Because I'm alive. Nobody answered. Because there was no argument. No counterpoint. No way around it. I was alive. The assets belonged to me. The decisions belonged to me. The future belonged to me. And somehow everyone in the room had forgotten that. For nearly a minute nobody spoke. Then something surprising.